What's going on, everybody? I'm Brandon from Walker's Woodworks. Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be building a shop cabinet with some router bit and drill bit storage, as well as some shelf storage inside. This is something you could easily do yourself within a weekend, and I'm actually going to have plans for it, so check the description for those. But let's get to the build.
It seems like every time I'm looking for a router bit or a drill bit, I can never find it in this mess. I teamed up with Bits and Bits, the sponsor of this video, to bring you guys a bit and shop storage cabinet. I made this with mostly scraps I had left over from other projects, so with some 3/4 ply I marked out and cut the pieces for the door. I used my track saw to break down all my sheet goods, but you guys could accomplish the same thing with a circular saw and a straight edge. I also make sure to label all my pieces when doing any sort of cabinetry like this with a lot of pieces that are similar. Then I continued cutting down the rest of the pieces with my track saw and table saw until I got everything down to final size. And labeled, of course. Once I had all the pieces cut, I changed out my normal blade for a dado stack. I set it up to cut just under 3/4 of an inch because plywood is actually just shy of a true 3/4. If you don't have a dado stack, you can skip this step and use pocket hole screws to attach the back to the sides. You would just need to trim the back down to fit between the two side panels. I set the blade height to 1/2 inch and then made my dado cuts along the back edge of each side panel. After that was done, I used a chisel to clean up any inconsistencies that was left over from the dado stack. Then I moved on to drilling the pocket holes in the sides and the back of both the top and bottom panels. I also took this time to drill in the shelf pin holes. Having a shelf pin jig really helps this process go much faster and you end up with a perfectly aligned hole. The Kreg jig version is a fairly inexpensive one, and I will link that below, as well as all the rest of the tools I use in this build in the video description below for you guys to check out. When drilling the shelf pin holes, I did make sure to stay away from the front edge pretty far, that way when the doors are closed the bits won't hit the shelves. Once the shelf pin holes were all drilled, I started the assembly by first clamping the top, bottom, and sides together. You can use wood glue here if you want, but I just don't usually do it on shop furniture where I use pocket screws. Be sure the pocket holes are facing the back panel and not the front on the top and bottom panel. I do, however, use glue when I'm doing a rabbet joint. I secured the back panel with some pocket hole screws and then some brad nails along the rabbet joint just to make sure everything was staying in place while the glue dried. I'm using 105-degree full overlay soft close European hinges on this cabinet. There's a couple different ways you can drill the holes for these. They come with a template so you can mark the holes. The large hole is drilled with a 35mm Forstner bit. You can freehand it like I'm doing here, but it's kinda hard to keep everything nice and straight. Or there are a few jigs out there like this one to make it a lot easier and cleaner process. Once all the hardware is installed, the hinges just clip together. This type of hinge makes taking the door on and off much easier. If you plan on making a bunch of cabinet doors with this style hinge, I highly recommend one of these jigs. It's so much simpler. I always install the screws by hand because it is fairly easy to strip them out in the plywood. After the cabinet was assembled, I turned my attention to making the bit rails. I had some 8-core alder left over from a table build, so I decided to use that up. I cut it down into 10 1-inch strips, 8 for the router bits, and then 2 for drill bits. I marked out a couple different patterns depending on what bits I wanted to put in that specific rail. I kind of categorized them by shank size, and I also used a couple rails on the router bit side to hold my Forstner bits. Once I had them all marked, I took them over to the drill press and drilled them out with a piece of tape for a depth gauge. I used a Forstner bit that equaled the shank size of the bit I was putting in that rail. I then sanded all the rails to get a nice even surface. For the rails that would be holding router bits and Forstner bits, I cut those at a 45-degree angle at the table saw with the holes facing the fence. Once they were all cut, I spaced them out on the door how I wanted them and then attached them with glue and brad nails. The drill bit side was a little bit more time consuming. I actually went through all my bits and then drilled each hole with the corresponding drill bit so it would fit in that one spot. It was an effort to stay organized. We'll see how long that lasts. I tried to keep them in a straight line, but a couple got a little off. Once they were all drilled, I attached them with glue and brad nails, but I made sure not to shoot a brad nail through a hole where a drill bit would hit it. The last step was to make some handles for the doors. You could use some store-bought ones, but I had some walnut laying around and I kind of like the contrast that it gives off of the lighter colored wood. I just cut some blocks and then cut a 45 on them to have something to grab. I sanded them nice and smooth and then attached them with glue and brad nails. Once the handles were on, I just clipped the doors back on the cabinet. You'll likely have to adjust the hinges just to make the doors line up properly, but it's fairly easy and there's several different adjustments on these hinges. It's always so satisfying when you close them and they line up perfect, especially with that soft close. I put a few coats of spray lacquer on there just to bring out the color and give it some protection. When installing it to the wall, it's better to do it with the doors off. I used a level inside the cabinet to make sure it was straight and then just anchored it to studs with some construction screws. Eventually that wall will get some plywood like the rest of the shop. I opted to just use 2 shelves for now, but I did make a third one in case I ever need it later down the road. While I'm loading up this cabinet, I wanted to take a second to thank Bits and Bits for sponsoring this video. I've been using their bits for quite a while now and I'm really liking them. The Astra coating is great for higher speeds and it extends the life of the bit. One of my favorite bits is the 6220 Astra coated white side surfacing bit. It works great for flattening slabs. You can pick it up as well as the rest of the awesome products they offer at bitsandbits.com, and I also have a coupon code for you guys to use. Check the description for that. Thanks again, Bits and Bits.
Well, that wraps up the build. As you guys can see, I got router bit storage over here with a little bit of room to grow, some drill bit storage over here, plaque I made just to kind of take up room and it looks kind of cool. And then I got all my finishing supplies in here as well to kind of get those out of the shop. Sawdust and everything, they were just on an open shelf over there, so it'll be nice to have those all in one spot. Like I said, I'm going to have plans for this. If you guys want to check those out, they'll be in the description below. And we'll see you guys on the next one.